We all woke up to a barrage of tweets from the Chief of Defense Forces, General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, calling for the US Ambassador William Pope to apologize personally to President Yoweri Museveni, or else he leaves the country. That has continued to brew diplomatic tensions between the two countries. Earlier, we saw the government of Canada expelling Uganda's ambassador, and Ambassador Joy Ruth Aceng was recalled by Uganda for diplomatic misconduct. We also know that the Minister of Foreign Affairs has been in the news for allegations that Uganda's mission in Dubai has been operating a casino. One of the top officials implicated in this saga is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, General Jeje Odong. How does Uganda relate to the world? In this episode of The Hard Questions, we take a deep dive into Uganda's foreign policy and foreign affairs. And it is special because my guest on the show is Raymond Mujuni, who is the Deputy Director at the African Institute for Investigative Journalism. Raymond just returned from the University of Oxford, having pursued his master's in international relations and diplomatic studies. Raymond, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Solomon. This is a difficult conversation to have. One that is
welcoming you back officially. Welcome
I didn't hope this would be the best welcome, but yes, I will take it.
It's good to have you on the show. Listen, let's start off this this show with the tweets that came our way. We all woke up to these tweets, and I just wanted to read them in part. General Muhoozi Kainerugaba tweeted, and I quote, "Fellow Ugandans, it's my solemn duty to announce to you that we are as a nation are about to have a serious confrontation with the current US ambassador to our country for disrespecting our beloved and celebrated president and undermining Uganda's constitution," he posted. "If this current US ambassador does not apologize to Musei by Monday at 9 a.m. for his undiplomatic behavior in our country, we will demand he leaves Uganda. We have no problem with the US. As I have said many times, it is a country we love and admire. But lately, we have a lot of evidence that they have been working against the NRM government." What is your analysis of this statement from a military chief?
Thank you, Solomon. I think that General Muhoozi Kainerugaba occupies various positions. He is the current Chief of Defense Forces. He is a special presidential advisor for special operations. We do not know the context of the special operations. He is a son to the president. He is the leader of a political movement, the PLU. So it's oftentimes hard to contextualize the nature of his tweeting and what it's intended to achieve. What I can say for certain is if the government of Uganda had a problem with the government of the United States diplomatically, they would escalate that through official channels, and that would be through the Foreign Affairs Minister, who would write something called a note verbal to the US ambassador, and then that escalation would be sorted at that level. It's healthy, actually, in international relations for countries to always mention where they're unhappy with each other. It often starts from the fringes, and the fringes, I think that now the interpretation of this tweet is that these are the fringes before it becomes official. I can say for certain that General Muhoozi Kainerugaba definitely has a lot more access to information than the rest of us have. The US ambassador also has a lot more access to information about their relationship with Uganda than the rest of us have. And until we're allowed to see the access to that information, it's very likely that we do not know enough about what we are commenting about. But we know enough in terms of context around what's happening in Uganda. And the fact is that Uganda has a declining civil and political rights situation. We've seen over the years changes to the constitution. We've seen agitations from political opposition. We've seen political opposition people being detained for longer periods of time without trial. We've seen just civil society rising up against these detentions and the manner and behavior. And that agitation in civil and political rights, of course, has a bearing on the Ugandan foreign affairs and the Ugandan international relations. Civil and political rights are first rights guaranteed by our constitution, but they're also rights that are recognized internationally. And at an international stage, we have to be fair in our interpretation of the way we behave. The international system is built to be anarchic. There's no policeman. There's no one you run to say, please be the policeman for this issue. So countries relate with each other based off of their interests. And countries construct that relationship with state officials, but they can construct a relationship with individuals within the state. So you will often see, for example, statements from the US Embassy that say, our relationship with the Ugandan people. That's very different from our relationship with the Ugandan state. You might also see in that tweet, for example, they mention very specifically the ambassador of the United States, not to mention United States, the government in general. So you have to also interpret those nuances in understanding this escalation. What I can say for certain is that we're definitely having this interview way past Monday, 9 p.m. And that should tell you a lot about the context in which that tweet happened. And I think that until we are allowed a lot more information about this relationship between the US and Uganda, until we're allowed to see the insides and the outsides, we do not know enough yet about what we are commenting on.
So this conversation comes after the US statement, Department of State, sanctions top government officials. Designated is the word. And the US is very clear. And I just wanted to read that just before that tweet came up, there was a list of police officers who were designated by the US. And they said they will not step in the US. And those police officers, this notice was given out by Matthew Miller and posted on the website. Mm-hmm. This follows the sanctioning of different top government officials. You have 3 top police officials who have been sanctioned. But before, you had other top government officials, including the former Inspector General of Police, General Kale Kaihura, including the former director at the Chieftains of Military Intelligence, Major General Kandiho. You have the Speaker of Parliament as well sanctioned top government officials. Could this suspension have triggered? Because we're really thinking of where is this coming from? Could this designation of top police officers have triggered this tweet? I mean, he just woke up and just started writing.
It definitely fits into the profile. Like I said, there's a declining relationship between the US and Uganda, particularly around civil and political rights. And again, you have to place sanctions in the context in which they happen. Every country has diplomatic relations with each other. And with those diplomatic relations come foreign policy. So diplomacy and foreign policy are slightly different. Diplomacy is, look at it as the pipe. Foreign policy is the water that goes through the pipe. The water can be blue, it can be white, it can be red, it can be different for different purposes. The relationship between the US and Uganda still exists, but the construct now within the foreign policy is how do you deal with a country where you have declining civil and political rights? How do you relate with each other in that regard? And the US has been insistent on the use of sanctions as a foreign policy tool. We've seen it being applied for human rights violations. We've seen it being applied for corruption. And in all cases that it has been applied, the people who have been sanctioned are often people who have
committed.
Cases, yes, There are cases against them in court. There are cases against them that have been engineered in their domestic constituency. And again, like I told you, this international system is very anarchic. So there's no policeman. So the US is not effecting any problems on Ugandan state officials. It's now, if those state officials wish to relate with the United States in that regard, if you want to travel to the United States, if you want to use technology that the United States has a hold on, then you must behave in the way that the United States wants. It's very difficult where Uganda is to be a country that is landlocked to start with, a country that has a growing population, a country that has agitation and needs around its development. More than 70% of our budget currently, or our revenue, is going to paying debt. So you need money for basic development. And the construct of the relationship between the United States and Uganda for a long time has been an aid relationship. So it's not an equal relationship. It's not a relationship of equals, really. One country has problems. One country is a global leader in many regards. That doesn't mean that Uganda shouldn't have its inherent dignity to say, as a country, this is what we want the US to look like and behave like in Uganda. But the tools available for us to make the US behave and look the way we want it in Uganda, at least according to the way Ugandan state officials want it, those tools are not the same tools that the US has. So, for example, Uganda is well within its rights. The Minister of Foreign Affairs today, Jeje Odong, is well within his rights to sanction any United States official and state to them, you're not welcome in Uganda. You cannot use technology that's been developed by Ugandans. You cannot trade with Ugandans. You're welcome to do that. But what will be the effect of those sanctions? And I think because of the nature of the effect of the sanctions that the US has on the rest of the world, that's why many countries are very keen to not have a difficult relationship with the US. Now, in hindsight, what must happen? I think that's the question that the Ugandan state officials have to ask themselves. What must happen? The commitment to try people who have committed human rights violations is not a United States commitment. It's a Ugandan commitment written in the Ugandan constitution. So if you have a case, for example, these 3 police officers who were sanctioned, that is a Francis Zake case. If you have a case in court and evidence is well abound in the courtroom that these officers engaged in torture, it should fall upon the Uganda police force to enforce within its own institutions to say, these are police officers who've acted erratically, we will deal with them. And by dealing with them, you have a healthy relationship, first with your citizens, and then with the other partners that you engage with internationally. But also, Solomon, I don't want us to be blind to the fact that there is a competition for power globally. The US, for a long time, has acted as a unipole. Unipole basically means it has a collection of military and economic power over the rest of the countries that exist within the ecosystem. That has been declining. More and more people now recognize that we live in a multipolar world. For example, China today is a growing economy. By all intents, it will be a bigger economy than the US some years down the road. Russia is a military power. It's not an economic power, but it's a military power that is against the rules-based order for which this international system was constructed. You have players like North Korea who've never believed in this international system in the way it's constructed. And that agitation, that competition for power has a way in which it forces countries to act with each other. So Uganda has to see that competition for power. Someone at the Foreign Affairs Office, someone who is in the mold of the Foreign Affairs Minister and their deputy have got to sit down and think to themselves actively, in an international system, who are my allies? How do I pick them? And how do I relate with them in that regard? And when you construct allies, allies have, there are things I expect of you, Solomon, for example, as an ED at the African Institute for Investigative Journalism. There are things I expect of you as my friend, that if you acted out of step of those things, our relationship would be very complicated. So that's what we're seeing between the US and Uganda, that the relationship has been complicated because there are things the US expects of Uganda, there are things Uganda expects of the US. And those things are not happening. And I think it would be helpful to sit down and talk through them very honestly and say, this is where the relationship is failing. But the onus to sit down and bring people to the table falls on Uganda. It doesn't fall on the United States.
Yeah, but those issues should have been put out through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, like you mentioned.
Yes.
What we're seeing, what this tweet tells us is that there is boiling within the system, and perhaps they are not communicating it. Maybe they are managing diplomatic relations. Someone has argued, perhaps rightly so according to his analysis, that perhaps the president had a meeting or has been given briefs about what the US ambassador is doing, because this guy in the street says diplomatic and diplomatic issues. So perhaps the president has shared over a dinner table, over, a meeting, and, they are talking through it. And General Muhoozi says, no, this can't happen. This is too much, And he goes to Twitter and he says, we're going to have a very big confrontation with the US, and I must warn you in this. And he says, well, I don't have a problem with the US as a country, but I have a problem with its ambassador. The ambassador is the head of state of the US in Uganda. And if you have a problem with him, then you have a problem with the country as well. But he then comes out to say, you need to apologize to my father. One, or leave. This tweet is an angry person who has just gotten privy to information that is very annoying to him, and is saying, look, this is too much. Like, no, we will not allow this. So he gets out his phone, out of anger, tweets, and he says, no, this has to stop. Like, apologize to Mzee Olive. The soldier says, you will have to go. You apologize to my father or Mzee, or you go. I have enough evidence that you're against the regime, you're against the NRM government. I give you until Monday. Like, apologize or leave. So it looked like he was privy to information that you said many of us do not have, over a closed meeting or dinner table or something, and then it erupts out and he tweets about it. And this has really caused, the US Embassy has posted before that they are closely monitoring what's happening, and they have also reacted to say, we have not gotten any formal communication. That's what you said, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But it cannot just be taken lightly that a military chief who was privy to information wakes up and just puts that out of anger. And later on, he deletes the tweet.
Yes, again, like I said, it's difficult of us to understand in what portfolio General MK sent out this tweet. Like I've told you, he is a special presidential advisor on special operations. We don't know the full extent of the brief that he has as a special operations. He is the chief of defense forces of the Ugandan army. At least we know the full brief of what a chief of defense forces of the Ugandan army should look like, because the constitution imagines it. He is a son to his father, and he's entitled to speak out with things regarding his father. So oftentimes we interpret his father to just be the president of Uganda, but there's also a relationship there between father and son. What I can say for certain, Solomon, again, is in the construct and conduct of diplomatic affairs, intentions of individuals are just one of the many things that can happen. You can have grand intentions, for example, as we've seen in Russia, for example. Vladimir Putin had grand intentions of taking over Ukraine. We're 2 years, 3 years into the war, he's nowhere near taking over, despite the military power he has, despite the obvious imbalance of power between Russia and Ukraine. So in the construct of the foreign policy of Uganda, intentions are just one of the things. It's possible that there are many other political advisors of the Ugandan establishment. It's possible there are many diplomatic actors behind the scenes also who are working towards making that relationship healthy. But it's also possible that there are people who have their own grievances. In much the same way the president of Uganda receives briefs, the US ambassador has political advisors who prepare for him diplomatic briefs every morning. I am sure there are people who read the Ugandan newspapers and prepare for him a political brief and say this is what's happening in Uganda. And he has to contextualize those briefs in the relationship Uganda shares with the US. So, as I've told you, the US currently is in a competition for power with actors on the global stage. Those actors include China, they include Russia, they might include India, they might include South Africa. And in that competition, it has to have a mass of allies on its side. The world wars have shown us that allies are an important actor. So sometimes you can pursue what people call deterrence. You can use those allies as deterrent factors. Other times you can use your allies as war fronts and say this is a war front. So Russia used Cuba as a war front to station nuclear weapons there in their war with the US. But again, like I said, it falls to the Foreign Affairs Minister of Uganda and his deputy to lock the room behind them and ask themselves the harder questions, which is, what is the full extent of what could happen if this relationship breaks down?
But before we get to that, whilst it's true that the Minister of Foreign Affairs is the one who is supposed to make these communications, but this is not the first time these diplomatic tensions have come up between Uganda and other countries. We know the diplomatic tensions that came between Uganda and Nairobi, Kampala and Nairobi, that the president had to officially write, the foreign affairs minister had to officially write to say official communication needs to come from foreign affairs and treat this as just a statement. The president had to apologize. So statements from a military chief on taking Nairobi were taken very seriously in Nairobi, that it took the president, it took the president's association to write. Foreign affairs had to write. We know that similar tweets caused diplomatic tensions between Ethiopia and Uganda. Abiy had to express his dissatisfaction to Yoweri Museveni about the conduct of a military top official. So these burst outs or tweets, whilst you say, they placed Uganda in a very difficult place in terms of how we relate with these countries who you'd want to call allies. They look at it differently.
That's true. Again, like I said, every country has, every embassy has their own briefs. Part of what goes into briefing is understanding the context in which things were said. The other part that goes in is to understand what is the effect of what has been said. You will often see this, for example, let's just take, for example, Uganda and Rwanda. We've been at it before. In fact, Rwanda has closed its border before. It's always, before that border was closed, there were things that were being said on both sides of the border. There were statements made by the president of Uganda, there were statements made by the president of Rwanda. And it always fell upon the diplomatic actors to try and interpret what is the context within which this is being said. And by interpreting the context, you learn the intentions within which something is being said. I am not very sure that we fully understand the context within which some of these tweets are being sent out. I am equally not very sure, or rather I'm yet to be convinced that these tweets are merely outbursts. Because again, if I read into them, they're written in clear English. The sentence construction is perfect. The intention behind the tweets clearly also looks perfect. So they look like tweets which are meant to achieve a certain aim or intention. And again, like I told you, we do not know what the full brief is. What does it mean to be a special presidential advisor on special operations? Nobody has ever told us that before. The only other person I know who holds that portfolio is a special advisor to the Kabaka on special affairs. We do not know the full brief of special affairs that the Kabaka has, for example, with the government of Uganda. But the existence of that office means that there are issues that a person in a position of influence and power knows that they need to address through that office. Now, it's injurious to Uganda's foreign policy for an advisor of the president to put out tweets that would put Uganda in a difficult foreign policy position. It's very injurious because how would Uganda be perceived on the global stage? How would Uganda be perceived inside the United States? If today the ambassador of Uganda in Washington, for example, Ms. Robi Kakonge, sent a diplomatic telegram asking to meet with the Secretary of State, would that meeting be interpreted together with these tweets? So that's the injurious nature within which those tweets, because they go into the briefing process, they become injurious to our foreign policy. But it's also important to know that states are rational actors. States act in their own self-interests. And my understanding of the state in Uganda is that it's a very captured state. There's hardly a difference between the Republic of Uganda and the NRM. And we've walked a long mile to try and separate those two entities, and we haven't. So oftentimes, problems of the NRM are problems of Uganda by extension. If the NRM has political competition in Uganda that it cannot manage, then it becomes a problem of the Ugandan state. Then we see Uganda police officers picking up Francis Zake. We see them acting outside of the Ugandan constitution. The question is, can the Ugandan state separate itself from the people that birthed it, which is the NRM? Because the state that we have today is a construct of the NRM. So until we achieve that, it's very hard to act lock and step. What I can tell you for a fact is that it's injurious to our interests because, one, for a long time, we were guarantors of peace in the region. We guaranteed peace. We still are guarantors of peace in South Sudan. We have troops that fought in Somalia to secure the Somalian coastline, but also to fight off Al-Shabaab there. We have troops in Central African Republic who fought against the Lord's Resistance Army and pushed back against what you'd call terrorism, which is a global problem. We have troops deployed inside of the DRC. So our foreign policy in regard to deploying of troops for securing peace would fall under problems because the person who is sending out these tweets happens to also be the Chief of Defense Forces.
Yeah.
So they will be interpreted in that regard.
Yeah.
So for as long as our army continues to be a foreign policy tool, everything that the head of the army does is also interpreted as a foreign policy maneuver by Uganda. But again, I am alive to the fact that we have a declining influence. The mission in Somalia has been reducing and declining in influence. We now see Egypt, which is a much stronger military power on the African continent, has sent troops there. We saw the General MK himself inside of Egypt. I'm sure there's something that's being worked out between them. Inside of the DRC, for example, too, there's been some attempt to try and reduce the number of foreign forces fighting inside of the DRC.
Yeah.
So in a large scale, those tweets will be injurious to the Ugandan foreign policy. But also you need to interpret them as the Ugandan state trying to survive as a rational actor.
Yeah, justifiably so, because when you look at the US relations with Uganda, you talked about economically, they invest about $1 billion. And part of that money was going into military support. We know that the US was supporting the AMISOM troops. Yeah. In Somalia, we know that the US was part of the team that trained our soldiers inside the DRC. We know that the relationship between the Ugandan forces and the US forces have been cordial until, when these diplomatic tensions started, that the US significantly cut its budget support to military in Uganda, significant budget cuts.
And when you have these tweets, like you mentioned, they leave us in a very different position, because the US as well is interpreting these tweets from a military chief. So they make big consequences to some of these tweets at a diplomatic level, in terms of the investment the US puts in Uganda as well, but also in terms of the investment that the US puts in our military. I know it has significantly brought, but still, Uganda continues to enjoy some degree of support from the US embassy and the US as well as a country in terms of its military presence, which is fundamental for its foreign policy. I think what Uganda has presented to the world is we're a peacekeeping country. We have troops here, we have troops there, we supported South Sudan, we're in Somalia, we're in DRC, and we're happy to send troops to stabilize Africa. And that has really been a core sale at the global level. When you see these tweets and tensions come through, and they don't only affect the US, but also US and its allies. So this information will go through to the EU. I'm sure the EU has been briefed. About what's going on really. Everyone is closely monitoring. And you've put that in perspective very well. I thought that we could, so what next? Before we can wrap up this US-Uganda diplomatic relations, what do you see in the near future?
Solomon, you've got, every state is a rational actor. I'll give you a good example. Kenya just became a major non-NATO ally. The president of Kenya, William Ruto, went to the US. They rolled out a red carpet for him, had a dinner for him, had a dinner with Kenyan business officials, and accorded him what you'd call the highest diplomatic acclaim in the country. On his return, 14 days apart, he traveled to go to the China-Africa Summit. China is in competition with the US. They're not in confrontation, they're in competition with each other. Now, Ruto is acting as a rational actor. Two people competing for power who have incentive to get you as an ally can validly give you things. And when they give you things, you settle your own domestic constituencies. Now, the Ugandan state, as a rational actor, needs to sit and vet through its own relationships and say, what do we gain from having a confrontational relationship with the US? Now, a competitive relationship is different from a confrontational relationship. A confrontational relationship will be damaging to both sides because bureaucrats and officials in both countries start to work against each other. Competitively, though, bureaucrats and officials start to ask, how do we work with each other? How do we compete with each other? Or what are those pain points that enable us to survive? People must always ask themselves this question. The US is a massive nuclear power. It has military might that no other country on the world scale has. Why is it that in its competition with China, it just doesn't send nuclear bombs, bomb it down to scratch, raze it to the ground? Because a confrontational relationship with a country is a very, like world history has taught us that confrontational relationships are dangerous to countries themselves. Competition is healthy. The US economy survives now because of China as a competitive power. China manufactures goods cheaply for the US economy, the US buys them. Because of China being a manufacturing power, China must demand dollars. And when you demand dollars, the Fed Reserve remains a strong Fed Reserve, and the financial services of the US remain as strong financial services. Now, those two countries understand what it is they bring into the international arena. Uganda has to sit and ask themselves, what do we bring into the international arena? Like I've told you, we're landlocked. Being landlocked means that your goods, exports and imports have to pass through another country before they're sent into the international trade sphere. Number two, we have a growing population on a fixed landmass. By 2050, we will have a population density problem, which will have internal political dynamics of its own. Number three, each of our neighbors, with the exception of Kenya and Tanzania, has been at war in the last 20 years. We need to ask ourselves the more important question: what made the UPDF a foreign policy tool? What made the UPDF this tool that was able to have out-of-area expertise, fighting in jungles in the DRC, fighting in deserts in Somalia, fighting in completely Islamic countries like Central African Republic? That's a massive foreign policy tool at our disposal. And we need to ask ourselves those questions more intently and say, if our relevance is coming because we're able to secure peace between our neighbors, if our relevance as a foreign policy asset for the international ecosphere is also coming because of our ability to create peace in those areas where countries get permanent mineral goods so that they're able to compete globally, then we need to act lock and step. Today, the biggest competition at the global stage is for microchips. Microchips are important in the manufacture of almost everything, from mobile phones all the way down to military equipment. Now, the permanent mineral goods required for those microchips, majority of them are within Uganda, DRC, Kenya, Tanzania. We have a flood of them here. Companies of the US, may not even be the US government, companies of the US will want to come and do business to get those permanent mineral goods. But they cannot come to do business with you if the signals and interpretations they get from their government is that that's not a country we go to. So I would say the path now out of this problem is to ask ourselves more honestly, what is it that we are unhappy about with the United States? If we are unhappy that the United States government is funding civil society, why is it that that makes you unhappy? What's wrong about a civil society, an active civil society campaigning for freedom of the press, freedom of expression, things which are contained in your constitution? If we genuinely and honestly have our own national therapy about the problems we're faced with as a domestic constituency, then our relationships with the rest of the world can improve. But until those are healed locally, our relationship can't improve. Some of the sanctions that we're complaining about are sanctions that are being campaigned for by domestic constituents. There are people internally, Ugandans, passport holding, national ID holding Ugandans, who are bound by the Ugandan constitution, who do not believe that officials of government of Uganda can be held to account in any other way except through sanctions. How did they arrive at that conclusion? They arrived at it by looking domestically and saying, this person beats up journalists and tomorrow they get promoted. Now, locally, for the state, those things feel happy, they make you feel happy. They take away the immediate problem. If a police officer today arrests Francis Zake, it takes away the immediate problem, but it doesn't address the problem for why Zake exists. And because the Ugandan state is not addressing that problem, it's finding a problem with its domestic relations with its citizens, and that relationship is affecting its international relation. Now, the crisis is also that the world is not static. If the US withdraws $1 billion of aid from Uganda today, someone in State Department is looking at 17 other proposals from many other different places to put that money. So if your relationship with a major economic and military power goes down, then many other people around you will become more strong and powerful than you are. Kenya, for example, is now a major non-NATO ally. They are also the gateway for our exports. What does that mean for us? Rwanda is one of the countries that's most interlinked with middle powers, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and by extension, most of the countries in the West. What does that mean for Uganda? Tanzania has a strong relationship with China. They've executed the standard gauge railway. They're building bridges. They're moving economically. They're solving a domestic problem by engaging with the international sphere and also hedging their bets. What does that mean for you as a country in Uganda, saying to allies who've stood with you for a long time that I have a problem with you and the only way to solve this problem is through confrontation? rather than through diplomatic channels. So those dangers to our foreign policy are very eminent, and they will become domestic very soon. Yeah.
That's deep, what you just said. Or maybe we can look at it that way, that Uganda is trying to look elsewhere, China, Russia.
There's no problem actually with looking elsewhere. There's really no problem. Like I've told you, it's an anarchic system. You're welcome even to open diplomatic relations with North Korea today. You're welcome to open diplomatic relations with a place called Western Sahara, which is not recognized by half of Africa. You're welcome to do that. The thing is, when you do that, you have consequences that come with it. So the first consequence is, if you do not manage competition, is that that competition will make you the playground. You become the playfield. If Russia externalizes its effort in Africa and says, we're going to use Uganda as ground zero to see how we can relate with Eastern Central Africa, what does that mean for the people who are in competition and confrontation with Russia? You know, we saw Russian Wagner group forces fighting in Sudan. That attracted Ukrainian special forces to fight in Sudan. As a result, you now have competing forces with troops in your country engaging on lands which belong to your citizens, affecting your own development. So there's no problem with engaging with everyone in the world. In fact, like I said, Uganda should have the dignity to engage with every player as they see fit. But there's got to be strategy at the heart of that engagement. I do not think, for example, that countries like Japan are stupid by saying we will be allies of the United States. You shouldn't rule out countries like the United Kingdom, which are smaller island states, which say to themselves, hook, line, sinker, wherever the US fights, we will fight, even when they have issues with that fighting. I wouldn't rule out, for example, countries like Saudi Arabia, which have typically, oftentimes been in a brush relationship with the United States. You should ask yourself now, why is it that MBS now is not as confrontational with the US as it was before? Israel has bombed Iran, it's bombed Palestine, it's bombed Lebanon. Those are countries which are in the sphere of influence of Saudi Arabia, which is a major power player. There's a reason that Saudi Arabia is sitting back and saying, we are unhappy about this. They will say they're unhappy about it, but there's a reason they're not interfering. Because we are at a very difficult stage right now in international competition. The world is being remade, the world is being reshaped. And you do not want, at the end of that power competition, to be the one that picked the wrong card. And picking the wrong card means you have confined the citizens of your country for another 10, 20 years to this world being shaped by other people other than them. Now, there are lessons in history that Uganda can learn. Adolf Hitler of Germany took a very confrontational relationship with the rest of the world, and we saw how that ended. Napoleon Bonaparte of France took a confrontational relationship with the rest of the world. We saw how that ended. People will lionize you, people will, years down the road, history will write about you and say, yeah, this guy was a strong man. He fought against this person. But what the world will also remember is that you lost. And once the world remembers that you lost, the evidence is just there with your citizens. Today, Germany doesn't have the scale and influence that it used to have on the world stage before. France, which shaped a major part of how the world looks like today, doesn't have that influence again anymore. So in competition for power, it's always important, if you're a small strategic state like Uganda, to sit back and say, I will not show up for this fight because that fight affects this. Or if I show up in this ring for this fight, I could be punched and killed in a minute. Let me stay it out and wait and see how the punches go. If I feel I am able to contribute to the punches, then I'll show up into the ring. But if you're a young country like Uganda, we've just made 62 years as an independent state. We have our own problems. We need to educate our people. We need our people to have access to healthcare. We need critical infrastructure, roads and the like. You need to be very careful about how you go around international relations because you don't have the money to do that development by yourself. And that money is in the international ecosystem. So do you want to continuously engage with China that gives you loans at 5% interest, 6% interest? Or do you want, in the meantime, to be getting aid at 0%, but that aid comes with some level of significant influence on how the countries run? Do you want to engage with the IMF and the World Bank that give you 0% interest, but understanding that that engagement will have its own issues with the way your policy behaves? Again, to arrive at those decisions, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and his deputy have to lock the door behind them and talk about bedroom affairs. This is how we deal in the bedroom before we get into the sitting room, then from the sitting room into the rest of the world. And currently, we have a problem in the bedroom, in the sitting room, and outside in the world. So you can't solve all of those problems at once because you don't have the human resource, you don't have the finances to engage all of those confrontations at the same time. Yeah.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. That's deep. And you know, when you're speaking about that, it got me thinking, there are countries that have understood what you're saying, and they're taking advantage of it. Very, very strategic in, let's understand diplomatic relations. I mean, we were supposed to have a big airport constructed here in Uganda. When we played around with it, our neighbors took their friends in the Middle East, which were supposed to construct that airport here. They're now constructing it across the border. There are those that actually are now getting more funding. In Rwanda, for example, they are building a big vaccine manufacturing plant, which initially was supposed to be done here. So there are those that are watching your diplomatic ties and trying to take advantage.
Yeah, but again,
of that. But like you said,
the confrontation has been that, and I think this is the problem at the interpretation of it. People imagine, and I've heard this mostly from our state officials, people imagine that a close working relationship with international actors is the same or the equivalent of being ruled over. Rwanda is a classic example of a country with its own inherent dignity, which deals with the West as and when it wishes. Rwanda has spent the last 2 years being debated by the United Kingdom whether it's a safe country or not because it chose to engage with the United Kingdom to solve for the United Kingdom a problem regarding refugees. Rwanda said, we know what it means to be a refugee without a place or to call home. So we will take your refugees for you as you find a transit country for them. That had the impact of, even when the relationship was not as good, it's not as warm, people can still see the strategic end at the end of it. Now, it's a competitive relationship. I know many cases where Rwanda has felt indignified by the West and has written in a note verbal to say, we're not happy about this, or we are not happy about this. One of the confrontations, the US is a powerful partner of Rwanda, for example, but the US has never accepted to call the genocide in Rwanda the genocide against the Tutsi. Rwanda has insistently, every statement put out by the US regarding genocide, Rwanda has insisted to the United States that this is the genocide against the Tutsi. It's a competitive relationship or narrative. You do not have to fight them. You just have to let them know we're unhappy about this. If you're unhappy about the US ambassador in Uganda, you do not have to enter into a confrontation. You can compete and say, these are the areas we're unhappy about. And hear what the ambassador has to say and say, this is why I am acting the way I'm acting. That's why diplomacy exists. A foreign affairs official would summon the US ambassador and say, can we have a tea at my office? Can we talk about it? Other times, countries do what you call a diplomatic endeavor. You can host a large dinner. The US hosted a large dinner for President William Ruto. I'm not sure the US needs Kenya that much, but they hosted a large dinner for him because they see the strategic allyship that they need to benefit from him. So if I were seated as, Foreign Affairs Minister of Uganda, I do not see why not. I wouldn't have a private, well-arranged dinner in which the ambassador of the US and the chief of defense forces eventually meet each other on bare ground and talk to each other without the presence of cameras and start to iron out what is the problem in this relationship. That's what diplomacy is. I want to know what is the problem and what can be done to take away this problem so that you people talk to each other, because you stand to benefit working together than working against each other. Now,
I agree.
Yes, there are many actors who will be against that, which is why sometimes diplomacy is conducted in the cold. If you said today that you are hosting a dinner for the ambassador of the US with the chief of defense forces, there are people who are actors against that relationship, who are internal, domestic, who might work against it. So it's important that it's also discreet. So it shouldn't just be that we shouldn't get to a point where the only way out of solving a relationship is confrontation. That itself it's a very difficult place to be, number one. Number two, the rules of confrontation and the rules of competition are very different. And in confrontation, people deal with you as an enemy. In competition, people can deal with you as a perceived enemy. I might perceive Solomon to be an enemy, but I may not consider you an enemy. It's just a perception. I perceive Solomon to be my enemy because he didn't open for me the door. That's a perception I have. And then I come in here and you take away the chair and say, okay, Solomon has taken away the chair. This deepens my perception of him as my enemy. But is it true that Solomon is your enemy? Maybe he didn't open the door for you because he was rushing for a meeting. Maybe he took away the chair from there because he had something else to do. And that's important. In diplomacy, you can only understand those intentions by being in the same room. By sitting down with Solomon and saying, you know, I'm unhappy that you didn't open the door for me. I'm unhappy that you took away the chair. And Solomon tells you the reasons for doing it. And then from there, you're able to compete with each other. Yeah. But if it's a confrontational relationship, if I set out to say I'm going to fight Solomon, then Solomon will be fighting back against me with every resource he has. And then I will also fight him with every resource I have. And at the end of the day, we are burning resources to try and arrive at a conclusion.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Thanks for the context of this, because it's deeper than what we see. It places it in the global scheme of things. We have a few minutes left, so I thought we could talk about the story that has been making headlines of our mission in Dubai having a casino. It was a big story here. The Daily Monitor ran with it as a headline, and I think it was written by Frederick Mosisi. And so many allegations there. And I have heard from close circles that the UAE is now, like, they're looking deeply into that issue. And they're investigating it. Where does this place us? I mean, in the global scheme of things, hearing that we operate in casinos, in an embassy. And I know that the president has been investigating it as well. There were people from ISO and the investigations arm flew to Dubai, investigated this. There's a report before the head of state. But these are allegations that put us in very bad light globally.
Yes, that's true. The world over, embassies are protected spaces. Whatever happens in them, the host country cannot do much about it, because there's a Vienna Convention that protects embassies. But also world over, there is a behavior that has come to be expected of ambassadors. And Ugandan ambassadors, not all of them, but some of them have acted out of that. They've acted out of step in many ways. And much to the credit of Foreign Affairs, I think last month they held their first retreat for ambassadors to basically talk with each other and say, where are we failing? But I've also noted this, and this is through visiting many of the countries, including the United Arab Emirates, that in those other countries, it's when you are appointed as an ambassador or appointed as a deputy ambassador, you have to undertake some diplomatic schooling. So it could be a month, 2 months, 3 months, in which people who are keen and conversant on foreign affairs, on diplomacy, talk to you about how to behave. Because as a diplomat, you are a different individual in a country. You have protections that fall to you. The host country itself cannot do much about you. You know, if Solomon is our ambassador to Kenya, the host country can't do much about your activity there. The laws there, in many ways, do not apply to you because of a convention that was signed by all these countries. So the behavior of ambassadors is often corrected by the countries that send them. It's not corrected by the countries that they've been sent to. And when countries that you've been sent to complain back to your host country and say, we have a problem with this person, it's often a reflection and a failing on the part of the host country. And I think that that's the problem we have. As a host country, we really, really need to think long and hard about what it is we're doing in this international ecosystem. I'm aware that there's a lot of lethargy in the system. People are tired in genuine forms. Almost all institutions of the country are tired. The institutions that built what today looks like the Ugandan embassy were old, like 70 years old. Today, diplomacy has moved on. We've seen now embassies hiring what they call digital officers, who are in charge of managing the digital relationship between countries. And digital relationship is different from personal relationship. It's how does our ambassador tweet on special occasions of this country? How does our ambassador tweet when they attend events? How does our ambassador address the other party? If you come from Uganda, for example, the head of state here is the president. If you are the ambassador to the UK, the head of state there is the queen or the king. How do you relate? How do you address the head of state in that country? And all those things fall down to the idea of diplomacy. It comes out of the word diploma. A diploma was something that the kings gave to people and told them, take this message to the other person. Now, what I think that the Ugandan diplomacy is suffering at the moment is not detached from what Ugandan state officials are suffering round the board. I see this, for example, in KCCA. We've just had officials of KCCA who've been fired with disgrace for the way they handled Chitezi. That lethargy in the system is everywhere, and it's not limited just to the embassies. There should be an attempt to address the conduct of our officials abroad. And I think that one of the best ways to do that is to have a formal diplomacy school in Uganda that addresses how Ugandan ambassadors should behave internationally. And we are not out of resources. The former Minister of Foreign Affairs is still alive, Sam Kutesa. We have diplomats of repute, Eli Karuhanga, still alive. Ambassador James Mugume, still alive. You have a chance to use those people as archive history and knowledge to tame the way your ambassadors behave, or to even just share knowledge on how ambassadors should behave. But if you don't do that, then there's a problem. But also the other failing could be that how much leverage does the Foreign Office here have on ambassadors that are sent abroad? So the failing could also be the manner in which appointments are met. If someone perceives of themselves as bigger than their Foreign Affairs Minister, who is the person that has given them the instructions they go with, then there will be a problem with the way they behave with the Foreign Affairs Minister. They can't be brought to account.
Yeah, but that particular incident of operating a casino in Dubai, what do you make of it?
It's indiscipline of the highest order. It's, I would say you lower the reputation of the country in the eyes of the United Arab Emirates, in the eyes of officials working in the United Arab Emirates. You lower our reputation in the eyes of all the other embassies because, like I've told you, embassies do diplomatic briefing. They read the newspaper every morning and write a brief and say, this is what's happening in the country. So assume that all the other embassies that have embassies stationed in Uganda have received a brief and said, can you check our embassy and see if they're not doing the same? That reputation, our reputation goes down. It affects our foreign policy also, because now, the next time the president of Uganda meets with the emir of the United Arab Emirates, someone might be pressed to ask, please address this matter of a casino being run inside of the embassy. It also goes against almost every vein inside the United Arab Emirates. It's, as you know, it's an Islamic country, and they have issues around betting and casinos. So if you're running a casino in their country and running it from a protected space, they will feel very bad about it. So there should be an attempt to repair that relationship. But part of repairing that relationship should also be an attempt to address the issues that led to things like that.
Just to wrap this up, on the recalling of Joy Ruth Acheng, ambassador, Uganda's ambassador to Canada, also made headlines. What do you make of it?
Indiscipline again. When I watched those videos, I was shocked and with horror. When you're representing a country like Uganda abroad, you're representing all the citizens of that country abroad. There might be domestic politics in country. Those politics are represented internationally too. But you are an official of the state serving all Ugandans abroad. So I am yet to be convinced of any reason for why an ambassador should engage in a protest. I am yet to be convinced that the ambassador of Uganda, to send a message, needs to dress in a very specific color and walk the streets in protest. I am yet to be convinced of that, because you have a lot of power at your disposal, an ambassador. With your embassy, you have a lot of power at your disposal to address problems that you see happening in country. But also you have a duty to all citizens of Uganda abroad. If Solomon travels to Canada and has a problem with his visa in Canada, if you get arrested in Canada, the first port of call is your embassy. In any case, you can't get a visa to Canada unless Uganda and Canada have relations with themselves. And those relations are constructed by the embassy. They're constructed by ambassadors. So it's indiscipline of the highest order. And it arises out of ignorance around how diplomats should behave and how diplomats should be conducted. But it also arises out of lethargy within the system to try and address some of these problems. I do not think that the Ugandan government pays its ambassadors enough. I do not think that we give our embassies enough budgets to work with. I do not think that we give our ambassadors enough leverage also. I've seen smaller states which are not able to pay the ambassadors, tell the ambassadors, look here, whatever trade deal you do, 10% of that trade deal will remain to run the embassy. And that way, the embassy is conducted as a business unit abroad. And at the end of the day, it's a form of economic diplomacy also to say, we want to increase trade ties between countries, so we will allow for this to happen. And if you don't address those things, then you have issues that spill over and then become an international embarrassment. So it was a huge international embarrassment for us to have our ambassador, one, on the street protesting, two, sending out the statements that she was saying in country, three, doing so in the front of our embassy, and then endangering our relationship with the country itself. And I think that not only was she recalled, I think that you should make an example of such a person.
And that's where I was going to come. Do you think that the Minister of Foreign Affairs is interested in sort of punitive action against such misconduct like you mentioned?
I don't know if they're interested, but if they're not, they should be. They should be, because disciplining such an individual would send a message to all the other 42 embassies and high commissions we have, that this is how we must behave as a country. I know that sending people home in Uganda is not a good thing. People do not like to be chased from jobs. But it's the official way within which sanctions happen. So it should be official that this is behavior we don't condone, and this is the punishment that comes with that behavior. It stops other ambassadors from behaving that way, but also sets in within the framework of Uganda's diplomacy, it sets an example for how we will deal with the others. So other countries know that if this happens, this is how Uganda will deal with you. Yeah.
A lot. Our time is fast spent. Thank you. Raymond Mujuni, thank you so much
Thank you for having me.
Speaking to us.
You're welcome.
I've been speaking to the Deputy Director of the African Institute for Investigative Journalism. That's Raymond Mujuni, who just, by the way, came back home. Welcome back home again. On Uganda's Uganda in the face of the world. I'm Solomon Serwanja, and this is The Hard Questions.